And we're back. Okay, so this is chapter 6, which is about, it's called Carl Gustav Jung. And I've got a quote from him at the top, which states, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." So, chapter 6. It seems pertinent to elaborate on Jung because, despite his scientific veneer, he did more than anyone to marry psychology and spirituality. Jung was always fascinated with the occult. Indeed, his doctoral dissertation was on the psychology and pathology of so called occult phenomena. He migrated towards his mother's Eastern philosophy and rejected his father's Stoic Christianity. He later identified with the Gnostics, calling them the best psychologists. When Jung discovered the Gnostic writings, he said, "I felt as if I had at last found a circle of friends who understood me." The lost Gnostic Gospels were notably found in Egypt and date from the 2nd to the 4th century. And they're not in the Bible because they're Gnostic, they're not Christian. It's also understood that Jung had a spiritually haunted start to life. His maternal grandfather, who was a minister, regularly spoke to spirits, which included the ghost of his first deceased wife, who was Jung's granny. He also had second sight or clairvoyance, which is the ability to know or see things into the future or things happening in a different place. And Jung's mother also had visions. She would fall into trances and converse with the dead. It seems she also had dissociative identity disorder, as Jung sometimes heard her speaking in a voice that wasn't her own. Jung related that at night the atmosphere in his parents' house would thicken. In Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, published in 1963, he wrote, "From my mother's room came a frightening influence. At night, mother was strange and mysterious. One night I saw coming from her door a faintly luminous, indefinite figure whose head detached itself from the neck and floated along in front of it, in the air like a little moon." That's in page 22. Jung advised that he had repeated visions of a figure coming out of his mother's room. Jung also advised that when he was about 3 years old, a spirit guide called Philemon contacted him. Perhaps we can wonder about kids' imaginary friends. This spirit was one of his teachers that tutored him all his life. He observed that Philemon and other figures of my fantasies brought home to me the crucial insight that there are things in the psyche which I do not produce, but which produce themselves and have their own life. Philemon represented a force that was not myself. In my fantasies, I held lively conversations with him, and he said things which I had not consciously thought of. Psychologically, Philemon represented superior insight. Jung insisted, "I observed clearly that it was him who spoke, not I." With regards to paranormal phenomenon, we can also consider the following two regularly recounted experiences involving Jung's mother. So the first story is, Jung was studying in his room when he suddenly heard a loud bang coming from the dining room. He rushed in and found his mother startled. The round walnut table had cracked, yet there was no reason in why. Jung thought, "There certainly are curious accidents," and as if his mum were reading his mind, she replied in her other voice, "Yes, yes, that means something." So it seems her other voice, or alternate personality, had telepathy. 2 weeks later, a second incident occurred. There had been another loud noise, but this time it came from a large sideboard. Again, no one had any idea what caused it. Jung inspected the sideboard where they kept the bread and the bread knife, and he found the knife shattered into several places, but all neatly arranged in the bread basket. The knife had been used earlier for tea, but no one had touched it nor opened the cupboard since. The weirdness of the caper was confirmed when Jung took the knife to a cutler and was informed there was no fault in the steel, but that someone must have broken it on purpose. After these incidents, Jung became involved in a series of seances. 2 of Jung's female cousins were beguiled by seances, which in turn beguiled him. Seances are sit-ins or meet-ins at which people attempt to contact the dead, usually through the agency of a medium. People invariably use Ouija boards or tipping tables. Jung was impressed by how real his cousin Helene's spirit seemed to her. She told him, "I see them before me and I can touch them. I speak to them about everything that I wish as naturally as I'm talking to you." Apparently, Helle was an excellent medium. Sometimes she would enter a trance, fall to the floor, and breathing deeply, she would speak in their deceased grandpa's voice. It's like she was taken over by another personality, like DID, but it was seemingly dead relatives. Apparently, Grandpa's ghost first appeared to Helle when she was 5 or 6, so she arguably had schizophrenia. Jung was apparently captivated by spiritualism. He was convinced that it was possible to contact the dead, and he had no reservations about pimping out his little cousin's conscious mind. So Jung used Helle for his research. Having started medical school, Jung continued to meet secretly with a circle of female relatives to contact the spirit world. And for over 2 years, he attended and recorded Helene's seances, with his meticulously detailed observations forming his thesis. As it transpired, however, Helle became unwell. Sometimes her spirits would take over her in the middle of conversations in shops and in the street. Helly also spoke about being led away from her body by the spirits on distant journeys. We'll get back to out-of-body experiences and astral projection. It seems Jung endeavoured to quasi-scientifically rationalise this seemingly spiritual affair because everyone knows that ghosts aren't real. They're a figment of our imagination. Science is confident there's no spirit world, and Jung was a man of science. Thus, it would appear Helly had dissociative identity disorder. She wasn't channeling spirits, obviously, but rather these autonomous entities had to be unconscious psychic forces. They are autonomous complexes or archetypes gone wild. Apparently, Helly was hurt by Jung's diagnosis, his insistence that she was unwell, having some kind of dissociative disorder. Helly was convinced the visions were real, but then Jung said otherwise. Jung rendered ghosts an archetypal function of human experience, not an objectively existing metaphysical reality. He explained the ghosts he saw during seances were exteriorizations of archetypal images within his mind, originating in the collective unconscious of the human race. In this sense, the archetypes of the collective unconscious are the true sources of the supernatural. As mentioned, however, Jung knew that the ghosts were real. He later admitted that spirits are indeed metaphysical entities independent of the human brain. However, before Jung came out from beneath the scientific rock, Jung and Freud were getting on like a small house on fire. As touched on, they were the best of buds until they weren't. It seems Jung's spiritual musings freaked Freud out. Apparently, Freud was so displeased with Jung's curiosity with ghosts that he gave him the ultimatum, it's either me or your ghosts. The infamous poltergeist in Freud's bookcase didn't help. Thus, when Jung was visiting Freud in Vienna in 1909, and he asked him his thoughts on parapsychology, which sceptical Freud dismissed as tripe, suddenly a loud bang came from the bookcase. Both apparently jumped up, and Jung said to Freud, "There, that is an example of a catalytic exteriorization phenomenon." Jung explained that poltergeists are a projection of psychic energy that finds its centre in the unconscious mind. It's an exteriorization or acting out of dissociative pathology. It's also, however, purported that that was Jung's jargon for poltergeist. Poltergeist is notably German for malevolent spirits and that move objects and make a noise. Following his split from Freud and at a time of marital distress as he wasn't prepared to give up his concubine, Jung became somewhat psychotic. He could be seen playing in the garden like a child, hearing voices in his head and walking about holding conversations with imaginary figures like Philemon, his spirit guide. Philemon, who Jung described as a ghostly guru, was a real living personality, and he would walk up and down the garden conversing with this old man. Jung, however, met various spirit guides, which included a highly cultivated elderly Indian who told him that his experience was like many mystics. So Jung took a trip down the psyche's rabbit hole where he gathered insights about the collective unconscious. His creative illness, as it was later termed, notably started with a horrifying vision. Jung likened the assault of the unconscious to thunderstorms, but he felt compelled to endure them, to consciously submit himself to the impulses of the unconscious. It was of scientific value. Jung later acknowledged, "It is of course ironical that I, a psychiatrist, should at almost every step in my experiment have run into the same psychic material which is the stuff of psychoses and is found in the insane." Towards the end of his life, Jung wrote, "Those conversations with the dead formed a kind of prelude to what I had to communicate to the world about the unconscious. All my works, all my creative activity has come from those initial fantasies and dreams which began in 1912, almost 50 years ago." So he was speaking to the dead. As it transpired, Jung met spirits of the dead during one episode in 1916 when his house was crowded with them. He relayed that his eldest daughter saw a white figure passing through the room. His second daughter's blanket was snatched away from her twice during the night, and that same night his son had a nightmare about the devil. The next day, the front doorbell began ringing frantically. His family and the maids all saw it moving, but there was no one in sight. Jung wrote, "The whole house was filled as if there were a crowd present, crammed full of spirits. They were packed deep, right up to the door, and the air was so thick it was scarcely possible to breathe. As for myself, I was all a-quiver with the question, I don't want to say blaspheme, but for God's sake, what in the world is this?" Then they cried out in chorus, "We have come back from Jerusalem, where we found not what we saw." Jung said, "I did not know what it meant or what they wanted out of me, but he felt that something within wanted to get out. He felt forced from within. And thus began his automatically written work, 7 Sermons to the Dead." Jung said, "Then it began to flow out of me, and in the course of 3 evenings the thing was written. As soon as I took up the pen, the whole ghostly assemblage evaporated, the room quieted, and the atmosphere cleared. The haunting was over." It's noted that Jung initially implied these words came from Philemon, but he later attributed them to Basilides, who was a Gnostic teacher in Alexandria, Egypt in the 2nd century. So Jung did channel a dead person, it would seem. Jung stated that the start of the work was identical to a possession. Jung also developed active imagination as a therapeutic technique during his spell of enlightenment. It's a technique for granting the psyche freedom to express itself spontaneously without the usual interference from the ego editor. Not dissimilar from Freud's free association, which is a psychoanalytic technique, and saying whatever pops into our minds sans censoring. It's the art of letting things happen. It's a meditation technique, a trance state. We take a trip inside. Jung used this technique to look for Philemon and other spirit guides. The basic idea is to clear our minds, make a blank space, and whatever comes, receive it. We allow a fantasy to appear and engage with any autonomous figures that we might meet. Active imagination is notably a technique used in mystery schools. Thus, the initiate actively imagines, constructs an elaborate sensual image for which a disembodied spirit might inhabit. It's like people imagine their happy place, but when they get there, they discover some uninvited guests. So whilst Jung encouraged delving into the unconscious, he did, however, caution that subliminal personalities may overpower the conscious mind and take possession of the personality. Jung also used mandalas to engage with the unconscious mind. In various spiritual traditions, mandalas are used to help mystics achieve a trance meditative state. Like Buddhist and Hindu monks, for example, meditate on the mandala, imagining it as a three-dimensional place where deities reside. They provide a sacred space for the meeting of minds, because if we engage with the image or the icon representing whatever deity, they connect with us. If we put ourselves into the icon will speak to us, answers will come to us. It has a magic effect. Whilst the centres of mandalas usually contain a reference to deity, Jung began to understand these as a reference to self. He referred to mandalas as the psychological expression of the totality of the self. As a Gnostic, Jung called the self the God within us. He believed that man's psyche was a microcosm of the macrocosm, which is God. The self and God are one. We are God at our unconscious core. This is essentially a Vedantic doctrine from the Vedas. We are, however, also the devil, because the devil and God are also one. Jung said, the adversary is none other than the other in me. So there is no God or devil out there. Or maybe there is. Jung proposed that God revealed himself through the collective unconscious, which in turn has propelled all the myths and religious philosophies ever created. Jung further endorsed other curious phenomena like synchronicity. Indeed, Jung coined the term synchronicity for meaningful coincidences. These bemusing moments are not connected by cause and effect, but they're not by chance either. The emphasis is on meaning. Jung also endorsed astrology and the I Ching, a Chinese divination system, which he explained through synchronicity. He did, however, confess that the less one thinks about the theory of the I Ching, the more soundly one sleeps. And he admitted that the sources of the oracle's insights are the spiritual agencies that form the living soul of the book. Later in life, Jung discovered alchemy. As it transpires, alchemy is not merely the precursor to chemistry as we're led to believe, but rather it's a spiritual work. It's an occult art which entails spiritual evolution. Alchemists integrated archetypes, or daemons, into their psyche to enhance consciousness. They activated their spirit body. Indeed, it transformed them into gods who could even turn lead into gold. Alchemy teaches that God is in everything. The universe has a soul, and this soul of the world is the source of all knowledge. It's the ancient mind that Jung called the collective unconscious, and this great mind can be accessed by the Philosopher's Stone, which is our light spiritual body. Okay, that's chapter 6 finished, so we will get on to chapter 7. Okay.